magazine's Top 500 of All Time list. This week, as we dig into the legendary career of Joni Mitchell, as we take in her album Blue, we thought we'd enlist some expert help to navigate the legacy of Joni Mitchell. It's not often that we are joined by a New York Times best-selling writer that has also contributed reviews, profiles, and criticism to, among others, as Rolling Stone, NPR Music, Spin, The Guardian, Billboard, and Time. We are very fortunate this week to be joined by Annie Zaleski. She has also written many great articles over the years about Joni and the various stages of her career. Annie's latest book, Stevie Nicks and 50 Songs, came out in May of 2026. She's also written best-selling books about other artists with a strong emphasis on the women that have come to shape the musical landscape of the 20th and 21st century. Welcome, Annie.
Thanks for having me.
All
Thank you
right.
for coming on.
Yeah, as we said here, we're learning about Joni. I think for me and for my co-host as well, it's somebody whose name we saw in kind of the sphere of things for so long, but never knew too much about. So you've written a number of books about female artists that have made these huge impacts culturally as well as in the music world. What is it about Joni that still has her towards the top of the list, if not at the top?
I mean, first and foremost, like we just talked about, like Stevie Nicks, early on, Joni was a massive influence on Stevie Nicks. And Joni's also been an influence on Taylor Swift. So, I mean, first and foremost, her long tail impact it's basically like her music is sort of rippled out, like when you put a stone in a body of water. She is just so influential because so many women have found her music and really found meaning and resonance in it. And I think that's because that Joni is extremely vulnerable. She was, especially early on, was really narrating what was going on in her life, whether it was going on a massive road trip, going through a breakup, just trying to actually figure out who she was, kind of a coming of age thing. And so that is really, really that vulnerability back in the early 70s was not very common, especially coming from women, just because rock music was so male dominated and male oriented. And I mean, and that's the key, right? Is that Joni wasn't necessarily, she was very folk oriented and definitely had a pop bent, but she definitely crossed over into rock music, and that was very also unusual at the time. But yeah, and the fact that she's gone through so many different iterations. She's done jazz, she's done a little bit of like rock and roll, like we said, folk music, obviously folk rock, pop music. She's kind of run the gamut and blues, duh, of course,
Right.
blues. And I mean, so like she's kind of also really kind of shape shifted over her career as well in sort of ways, not necessarily following trends even. So I think that, I
Totally.
mean, yeah, I mean, so I think that's kind of the broad overview of why, just some of the reasons why I think that she's really just such a singular musician.
Yeah, I mean, my first real exposure to her was I was a big Jaco Pastorius fan of the bass player, and I came to listen to Hejira, and then came up again in conversation with somebody 10 years later, and it's one of those. Wait, this is Joni Mitchell. I thought this is Joni Mitchell, the folk artist, and come to find out, as you said, uh, many colors of the Joni Mitchell rainbow. So she's going to evolve over time, and she has a lot to offer.
And she didn't want to be pigeonholed. I mean, and that's the other thing is that she really refused to be pigeonholed. And, especially as being kind of an iconoclastic woman, that sets you apart, basically, very much so. And, there's a little bit of kind of stubborn defiance in terms of what she wanted to do artistically. And that's also just very, very appealing, especially to, people who maybe don't want to just stay in one musical lane or maybe have ambitions to do different things or be able to spread their wings and do something else down the line. She's a great role model for that.
Right, and we've actually on the show so far we've done several David Bowie albums just by random chance, and we find that same thing too, where that genius level just shines through because it's I don't want to just do Ziggy Stardust over and over. I don't want to do Hunky Dory over and over. And these artists you can tell are really in it for the right reasons because they do want to keep redefining themselves and offering new and not just repeating it just for the paycheck. So super admirable. So the album Blue we're talking about this week, when did Blue first become an important album to you personally, and how has that evolved over time since you've learned more about her and more about the music?
It's funny, I came to Blue a lot later in life, and I think it was sort of and Joni as well. And I think what's weird about it is that I feel like I had to be almost like older or I had to be a little bit more of a seasoned music fan to really appreciate what she was doing. And I don't want this to seem like I'm some like, come lately to like her music, because obviously she's been sort of a presence, but something about the music and the sophistication, it came to me, I mean, I would say probably in the last decade or so. And I
Okay.
It's
think,
very dense, like
yeah,
the album.
well, absolutely. It's very dense. And I mean, I've always loved the singles, like River is, like I said, I've written little essays about River because that's beautiful, and A Case of You as well, just the sadness about it. But there was just something I think about, where I was sort of at in my life and sort of at where my listening. It's the same thing with Bob Dylan, like I definitely have come to appreciate Bob Dylan more as I've gotten older. And I feel like that's actually a little bit out of the ordinary. I feel like a lot of people when they're teenagers might come to both things, but for whatever reason, my life and my, emotions and lyrics and preferences, it all sort of aligned in the last decade or so. But as I've learned more about her, I think I've come to appreciate Blue more, and I've come to, because my old inclination when I hear about any album being like, this is the artist's greatest of all time, I always want to know why. I always want to dig in and be
Yeah.
like, what is it specifically about this? And then as I've kind of listened to this more and more, you see it, and but the thing about Joni is that she's subtle. She's not like, like I think some of the, you think of something like Pet Sounds, you listen to that and there's some very obvious songs. You're like, yes, of course, this is greatness. But Blue is so subtle, and each individual song that's a great song, it's very nuanced. And I think that's come to like light more and more for me as I've learned more about Joni and as I've become more of a really big fan.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree though, with your sentiment of just like you kind of have to be in the right headspace at the
Mhm.
right time to be able to really get this. I can say, yeah, for me, 15 years ago when I'm in the throes of a metal and punk phase, like this Joni Mitchell album, it's like, what is going on here? Can we turn up the energy a little bit? But now that I have those listening ears tuned a little bit more, I can definitely appreciate the nuance to the songs. Doing the research to understand the meaning behind some of the lyrics and just getting like context to everything too, it enriches it so much further. So I know, yeah, we're definitely enjoying that one as well for those same reasons. But I think as teenagers, it probably was too smart for us, to same even with Dylan. We were spoon fed Dylan by some friends, and kind of had to have all the essentials, but I don't know if we got it.
That's exactly it. It's just that sort of, it's almost like you have to like slow down and really do deep
Oh yeah.
listening to all of her albums. And I think that's what
Hmm.
I think our modern pace of life is not conducive to albums like that because, and especially because, as a journalist, when I'm doing writing about things, I'm always, on assignment for doing things. And, I found myself, I write a lot about rock music. And so I was like, heavy into this and pop music, but you
Hmm.
almost need to be like, I'm going to take an afternoon and I'm going to turn on Blue and listen to it multiple times and do deep listening and really focus on it.
Yeah.
And, and I mean, that's an amazing luxury, I think, just because all of us have such busy lives. But that's what I think Joni's music kind of demands that attention.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. We've talked with, a number of critics and folks that used to work for the Enemy magazine and just about like what their listening experience is now. And everybody talks about, well, most of the time if I'm absorbing new music, it's when I'm in the car.
Yeah.
And, like I'm trying not to hit people when I'm in the car or, trying to find the right turn. So how much can I really be analyzing, lyrics and, chord structure and things of that nature when I'm driving around? But yeah, that patio listen that you get every 3 months, that's where it's at, and that's what an album like this is definitely meant for. If anybody out there's listening and wondering, like, do yourself the treat and yeah, carve out some time for
You don't want to be like sobbing in your car to A Case of You as you're trying to
it. Right,
in rush hour
exactly.
traffic.
Not a good look. Not a good look. And yeah, you're having to turn off your phone, and next thing you know, the cops pulling you over and you're crying and having to
Yeah.
explain it's because of Joni Mitchell.
It's just Joni, I
Yeah,
swear.
your officer. That's all it is.
Yeah.
So some words that came up that you used, and I think we can apply to this album and just Joni in general: raw, vulnerable, honest, transparent. I'm wondering if you can speak to the idea that, for the most part, like you said, music with this sort of intensity and honesty wasn't really made by women previously. It's something I guess we take for granted now, but prior to 1970, 1971, the female's role in the music world was just kind of to sing the lyrics the man gave her almost, and it wasn't an open book from their heart. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
That's absolutely true, and I know I mentioned at the top that like Stevie Nicks, when she was in Buckingham Nicks in the early 70s and kind of finding her way, she's talked about how meaningful Joni was. And that's because Joni was writing the songs. I mean, Joni was the one who was really chronicling her life, documenting her life and saying, okay, this is what's meaningful to me. This is what I'm feeling. And it's true, like post Beatles, basically, if you look at, the kind of the landscape of music up until the late 60s in California, it was a lot of men dictating and sharing their feelings and sharing their emotions. And it wasn't until kind of, I would say like the Woodstock era, maybe a couple of years before that, when kind of Joni started coming out, that it was really, people were starting to say, women have something to say. Like, and you can kind of see with like, Joan Baez coming out as well, of
Hmm.
course, Judy Collins, and all of these like women were starting to, kind of basically come into their own in a sense and kind of say, hey, this is our experiences are important too. And because it's true. I mean, when you look back, you have someone like Janis Joplin and Grace Slick, and they're so powerful singers. But their, mainstream sort of moment was very short-lived, and they were sort of
Right.
pigeonholed as being kind of one thing. And when Joni came out, she was definitely, as we just talked about, I am not going to be pigeonholed, but I'm going to be honest.
Yeah.
And yeah, and the idea, and I think for now, kind of like what you said, you kind of take for granted now that we have so many women musicians that are writing their own songs, putting together their producing their own records, making their own records, and that's a very normal thing. But yeah, the music industry was not like that, 50 some years ago. And so, and even going in 60 some years ago almost at this point. And so, yeah, I mean, she was such a trailblazer in terms
Yeah.
of what she wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy to think if you're leaving 50% of the population's, stories and feelings out of art, like you're kind of missing out on a lot of ideas that can really be important. So it's thanks to women like her that have definitely opened up that gate, and the world's better for it.
And
Um,
she was given the second half of different things. If a male is writing a breakup song, then we have the female perspective, right? We have
mhm,
the other person's point of view. And she
mhm,
kind of had that dialogue with certain people, songwriting wise. And that's important. That gives a more, fuller picture of kind of what goes on. And so that was
right.
also very inspirational.
At least two sides to every story, so we might as well hear some of them. Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, in learning about Joni, we did learn about her contracting polio at age 9, and how it left her hand permanently weakened. And then she went through the long road of recovery in the hospital. But this forced her to think outside the box a little bit and kind of altered her playing style and really shifted how she sets up her guitar into like some unique chords and open tunings. So obviously, like Joni Mitchell, she gets tons of love for her singing and her lyrics. Do you feel she gets enough credit as a composer and as a musician? Because I'm listening to this stuff thinking, this is just beautiful, brilliant stuff going on here that I would have never thought of.
I think now in kind of the modern era, she's starting to get her due for being kind of a composer and musician. Obviously, she's won a ton of awards and, in the past and did all that stuff. But I think the fact that when she had her brain aneurysm and went away and then came back, it was sort of a reminder of for people that wait a second, no, that maybe, let's honor artists while they're still here. I think she was maybe taken for granted a little bit until she went away. And then the fact that like, hey, and I think because there's so much more in modern music now, people are more willing and more open and, rightfully so to talk about these great women as being geniuses and being, brilliant composers. And I love the idea that, and I think, I have a disability myself. And so I love the idea that, she took something that maybe people might have perceived as a weakness or something that might have been something that would be a detriment. And she created her own art out of that, her own way of doing things. In the disability community, a lot of people will think about, okay, well, how can I'm faced with an obstacle. How can I get around it? Or how can I come up with a solution to make sure that I can, exist in a world that maybe isn't meant for me? And she did that. And I
Yep.
love that. I think that is, it's something for me, it's as an artist, everyone has something that they're kind of trying to deal with. Maybe some people are they try to play guitar and, they're like, this is not my instrument. Maybe I'm a more of a woodwind player, like,
Yeah.
when I remember when we were in, in junior or in elementary school, it's like, all right, let's try to play an instrument. And I remember trying to play trumpet. No, brass did not work. The embouchures. Tried to play clarinet. Nope, the embouchure did not work. And the thing that worked for me was flute. So I'm like, all right, let's go for it.
There you go.
You know?
Yep.
But I feel like that's a very kind of similar thing with her, that she's trying to figure out, okay, maybe I have a little bit of weakness in my hand. What can I do guitar wise that can, circumvent that? But it came up with something really cool then. And she came up
Right.
with such a singular way of doing things. And so yeah, you can tell that really excites me because I love that about her.
Well, and that's one of the reasons I love Tony Iommi as well. The guitarist for Black
Yeah,
Sabbath. He had lost a finger, so his kind of solution to play still was to basically do power chords, and because of that, now we have
power
Black
chords.
Sabbath and riffs and metal and all these things that like, oh, this is because the guy didn't have a finger. Like,
Right.
amazing. That's how you do it.
Exactly.
Um, so I kind of feel like, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. When I hear her music, there's definitely like a unique Joni sound to it. Do you think the songs still hit as hard if these are in, conventional tunings or, conventional arrangements? Or is that part of how she arranges the music and those chords she's come to play? Is that kind of what helps make the songs?
I think so. And I think it's a little bit of kind of everything. And it is funny, especially her early records, you listen to it and it is so distinctly her, and I think that's another thing about her, when you think about, as rock and roll post Beatles was kind of coming up, there were a lot of bands that sounded a lot alike. There were definitely, obviously, people were trying to rip off the Beatles and the Stones and maybe the Kinks to a certain extent, Beach Boys, obviously. And there were definitely a lot of like kind of cookie cutter things. But when you listen to Joni, it is so distinct. And I love that. And like I said,
Yeah.
I'm also left-handed, and so I tried to play guitar as a kid, and I was just like, this is just not working. Like I did not have I was not the Paul McCartney genius who could be able to play anything left-handed, unfortunately. But yeah. And so when I hear that, I'm like, oh, how do you figure that out? Like it's something just
I,
so cool.
I don't know if I've shared this story with our listeners, but I was 15 when I got my first guitar. And the way I found out that I was ambidextrous was I went to Guitar Center with my dad and picked up a guitar and naturally put it into the left handed position. So from that point on, the clerk was looking at me like, "You're playing it upside down. What are you doing? Like, this is how I hold a guitar. What do you mean?" "Well, you're playing left-handed." "Oh, okay." So ever since then, I've been one of those left-handed musicians that can't find enough gear compared to the right-handed folks,
Yeah,
and
and the
you know
and the
it
important
works.
detail there is, which I found out recently, everything else you're doing right-handed, correct?
Right, exactly. Most of it predominantly that, but like guitar and a few other like, it's probably my stronger hand on piano or
Wow.
a few other skills out there. But yeah, for the most part, predominantly right. For music, left-handed for some reason. Just
That's so
just
cool.
bizarre. Yeah. So I think we brought this one up earlier. A Case of You.
Yes.
Definitely, a happy motive. Oh wait, it's not a happy, motivating, uplifting song. It's a very sad song. It's become one of those songs that people treat almost like scripture. Is there a reason or something about it that helps that song to resonate across generations and genres? It just seems to be universally loved, like timeless.
I mean, first and foremost, obviously the lyrics, like the imagery that she has here. I'm a big fan of Sylvia Plath as a writer, and I read The Bell Jar as a kid, and I was so jealous because I was like, how do you write like that? Like just the imagery and the way she would write about things and around like everything in the world. I loved it. I was like, oh, I want to write like that someday. And this is a very similar song, when she's kind of, having a moment in her life in the way that she's describing something, the back of a cartoon coaster and the blue TV screen light. Like that's so evocative, right? So I love that. But I mean, first off, it's it really captures what it's like when you're in a relationship and it's like it's kind of push and pull and you're not getting what you need. I'm a lonely painter. I live in a box of paints, like thinking about
Mm.
something like that. Like how many, when you're an artist and you're a writer and you're finding solace in something. Um, and it's just not working. So she's really kind of working this out also like in real time. And I think that's the other thing is that this is definitely, it's kind of a story that's unfolding. And, especially about like this record and why I also like River is that there's enough detail in there that you can kind of get the gist of the story, but you can kind of put your own experience into it too.
Yes.
And so I think that's, part of it. So it means depending on where you are in your life or in a relationship, it can mean so many different things. And also just her delivery and the music is just so mournful. And I think that's why, like, that's not something, there's so much sincerity to what she's singing. She really believes it. And I think that's also another reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting way to look at it, though. It does feel like a lot of ways like a perfect template that she's handing you to say, like, this is my pain, going through this. I'll bet you can relate, but maybe yours is a little different, and you can put yourself into that situation and really just connect with it.
And the idea too that like, I could drink a case of you, darling, and still I'd be on my feet. Like there's so much of a double meaning of that because it's like, okay, so, maybe you can't get enough of someone and, and like you still like preserve your sense of self from it. But on the other hand, if you're drinking a case of someone, maybe you're totally drunk, but you're still on your feet. So you're
It's like an
saying
overindulgence kind of thing.
exactly. And you're saying this person, you are not treating me well. You're not going to knock me down. So even just those two little lines, there's absolute, there's such a different way of looking at it. And so I think that's the genius of it too, is that it's two sides of the same coin at the same time. And it's just, a brilliant way of addressing something ambiguous.
It's exactly. It's almost kind of unveils itself depending on what angle you're listening at. If
Right.
I'm feeling on top of the world, I might hear that, you're not going to knock me down kind of side of it. But if I'm feeling down, then oh, I miss you, and I could drink more of this, but I'm
Right.
not going to. So I think in learning more and even watching some interviews with her, there's a fun contrast between Joni, and I think it's a pretty common thing for most of us, but publicly, very confident, sharp, and uncompromising. Um, but with Blue, she's so emotionally exposed and vulnerable, and almost defeated at times. It's a bit of a counterbalance to the actual public persona. But how do those two sides of her coexist? Is that just Joni as a whole being?
It's, it's such a weird thing, I think, being an artist because, obviously you're writing and releasing in record Blue that is just so naked. She basically, she even said once, there's hardly a dishonest note in the vocals. That period of my life, I had no personal defenses. And I think that's a very famous quote from her. She's talking about just how vulnerable and naked, kind of these songs are. But I almost feel like almost like as a survival mechanism, you almost have to kind of put a little bit of like steel around you. You almost kind of have to have that shield because you're really putting everything out there on record. And, to be able to kind of deal with then like, all right, how do I interact in the real world when I have this thing out there? You almost have to have a little bit of a division almost. It's kind of the difference between, nowadays, I think, what do people put on social media? Maybe what you're putting on social media is a little bit different about what's going on in your real life. You keep a
Yeah.
little bit of something for yourself. So I feel like that Joni sort of toes the line a little bit with all of those things as well. And kind of like you have to. And I mean, and,
Right.
I think too, as an artist, you make this record, you put it out there, and there's a little bit of you that's like, it's out of your hands now. There's other people that are, that are going to have their own interpretations of it. So it's almost like it's a very cathartic thing. You get it out there and then it's the world's to kind of interpret.
That was your snapshot in time, and people can love it or leave
Mhm.
it, and yeah, from that point on, decide what you want to give them. I mean, that's definitely it. Definitely seems like a tough line to walk, but one she does pretty gracefully, I'd say. So you mentioned earlier a little bit too about like some other artists, Stevie Nicks and Taylor Swift being two of them, but there's a lot of artists out there, indebted to Blue. Are there any other contemporary musicians that you hear Joni's influence like particularly strongly, whether it's the playing, just kind of the lyrical style, the singing?
I mean, it's so funny. Like, that's such a big question because, one of the things that was funny when I was writing my essay on River, I'm like, how many people have covered River? And Joni Mitchell's website's amazing because they track everyone who has covered her songs. And River
Yes.
at the time, it was just like, it was literally hundreds of people who had covered this song. They're like mind-boggling. Um,
Hmm.
I think some of the obvious ones are people like Sarah McLachlan and Tori Amos. And, obviously Tori's covered Joni before, and, Sarah has too, I'm sure. And, there's just something about that, that like we talked about, that vulnerability and intensity that's in both of them. Obviously people like, Taylor and Stevie Nicks, exactly like we've talked about before. But what's cool about it then is anyone influenced by all of them, anyone who's a Stevie Nicks acolyte, you're influenced by Joni Mitchell. I think Harry Styles even. Harry Styles has definitely said, no, Joni Mitchell has been a big influence on me when I'm kind of making records. And you can kind of hear that too when you
I love
listen
that.
to
Yeah.
some of the newer records. It's a very singer-songwritery way of approaching things, and the instrumentation, is very traditional. And so there's a little bit of that in there. And so, obviously she's worked with, and Annie Lennox is another example, and I
Mm.
think any of the musicians who have sort of been on stage with her in recent years too, and Annie has talked about, I mean, when you look at like, listen to Annie Lennox sing, for example, and just the kind of the songs, she has such a powerful voice, but there is just so much of a personal bent to sort of what she's doing with that. And so, those are just literally just a few. I mean, we could do an entire episode where we would just went, down the line and said this, and this, just because she is just so influential on people, and their influence gets, transmogrified through different generations. But there's really something essential about being a singer-songwriter, writing about your life in an unvarnished way. That's the long and the short of it is. And that's, what I think Joni does so well. And that's where her legacy shows up. Almost any musician that does that, that's a Joni hallmark right there.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's almost a funny question even to me. It's kind of like, well, which singer, songwriter, folk musician looked up to Bob Dylan? Like, well, I
All of
don't
them.
know, any and all of them. Yeah, they probably wouldn't be the whole scene without these people. So yeah,
Yeah.
a little bit of credit there. So in talking about Blue, we're talking about an album that some would call like the greatest album put out by a female ever. Um, this is like number 3 on the Rolling Stone Top 500. Joni sometimes seems like she's uncomfortable with a little bit of the nostalgia surrounding her work and always looking to move forward. How do you think she feels now about Blue becoming this like mythological cultural artifact, so to speak?
I mean, it's hard to say. I think kind of like what you said, I feel like, she'd be like, "Oh, that's nice." Okay. And obviously when she's done shows, songs from the album, she plays them. But what I think is interesting is that, she definitely has done, she's not doing a straight performance. She's definitely doing like slight rearrangements, either where it's some vocals that are a little bit different, maybe there's some sort of, some of the instrumentation's a little bit different. So I think the way she deals with her legacy is just sort of evolving it. Like she's never, she's not the type of person that's like, let's go out and play Blue and let's just do it like exactly how it was on the record,
Hmm.
exactly how it sounds. She doesn't do that. And I think that's your answer right there, is that, she's going to interpret Blue how she feels at the moment and where she
Yeah.
feels like she is in her artistic life. And you can say that about any of her records. And I think that's what's so beautiful about all the shows she's been doing, and kind of her comeback, is that she's chosen the things from her catalog that obviously still mean a lot to her. And, and figuring out, decades after she recorded them, where do I find the meaning now? And that's what her
Right.
songs are. And so I think
No,
that's kind of the yeah.
I think it does. I mean, looking at her set list over the last couple of years, it does seem to be a good balance of like fan service as well as, like you said, what matters to her. It's not just, well, it's been 60 years since this and that. Let's do the album straight through. Like a lot of bands are happy to do and get the paycheck and do the tour. So yeah, even now, she's really holding that artistic integrity that is just so amazing about her. So one of the songs, I'll admit, like definitely felt like somebody was cutting onions in the room with me when I was reading about was Little Green, and just reading about the context on that one. Do you think knowing like the biographical context of these songs takes them to all to new levels? Does it maybe diffuse some of the mystery and kind of interpretation? Where do you sit on that?
I mean, it's funny because I feel like with this album, in particular, we all know that all the stories behind it, that she was, dating James Taylor at the time and it didn't end up working out and things like that. And like you said, like with Little Green, it's basically about her giving her daughter up for adoption.
Hmm.
And honestly, I've always thought that the songs work well on their own. And I guess as a music fan, I like knowing sort of the inspiration or maybe the origin
Mm.
stories of songs. I've written actually a lot of books where we, where is this actually from? I think that's really interesting, but I've never felt that that's taken away or been prescriptive on what the songs are. And it was kind of like what we were talking about before, that like A Case of You, maybe she wrote it about a specific incident or a specific sort of mindset she was in, but it's gone in such a deeper place and gone in such a universal place, or, in such a, you know, interesting place, basically, that it could mean a lot to different people. So I don't ever feel like tied necessarily to the description or kind of the origins of the song. And I think that's another, genius thing about this album is that, even though obviously the legacy of it and the inspiration from it, like I said, was very well known, it transcends it. And that's what all great albums do. And so I think that's very interesting, and not every artist can kind of get past that. I mean, there's certain Taylor Swift songs that she wrote about different people supposedly, or different situations, and they're inextricably tied. Like people just can't get past like, oh, she wrote it about this person or about that
Right.
person. And and Joni, for a lot of, now I think at least, has really escaped a lot of that. I think that maybe wasn't the case a long time ago. I think people definitely were more focused on her boyfriends or who she was dating, or all that stuff at the time. But I think now we're far enough removed from that era that people can really see the music in a different way.
And then for those listening to this in the future, just for a note, we are listening to this on the supposed day of Taylor's wedding
That's
too.
right.
So here we
Momentous.
are. The boyfriends are behind her, and now we can let the music stand on its own. And welcome to the Taylor and Travis era. So, but back to Miss Joni Mitchell here. So the album is called one of the greatest breakup albums ever made. I don't know. Listening to it, I think it undersells how much broader it is, and there's more than just the theme of breaking up. Identity, aging, artistic freedom, even disillusionment. Are there any themes that stand out in particular to you, other than just that breakup idea?
I mean, I think, kind of you hit on most of the ones that I think of too, but then, I know I mentioned this earlier with River, but the idea of, you know, self-discovery, I guess. And it's kind of like, who am I actually apart from, everything else? And that's kind of identity, but it's also kind of like when you're in the moment of something and trying to figure out who you are, apart from someone else, who you are in a relationship, who you are, outside of a relationship, and coming of age. Like there's something very, very potent when you're at the kind of the age that she was when making this record, and trying to figure out your life and trying to figure out where you're going to go next, either career wise or life wise. And I feel like there's so much of that in there. And then, but
Yeah.
then just also, thinking about what life means. She's a very philosophical writer, especially sort of, in the early 70s. And this album in particular, it's kind of, the title track, which, I'm gonna talk about probably at some point, but like it's like a Shel Silverstein poem. She's kind of personifying what blue is. And I love that. Like that's a very sophisticated way of looking at things. But it's definitely a little bit more existential as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, it's we haven't talked enough about the title track. But I guess that maybe it's a good time for that question of, do you have a favorite track on the album, or maybe one that doesn't get enough love?
And that's exactly it. I was going to say Blue. When I was, kind of, re-listening and everything. I mean, the simplicity of that song, I think, for starters. But I just, and that this is where maybe like if I had like really glommed onto this song as a kid when I was writing poetry and studying poets and things like that in English class, I would have been like, this is the song, this is the song,
Hmm.
I mean, blue songs are like tattoos. I've been to sea before. crown and anchor me or let me sail away. I mean, that whole the idea of what are you going to weigh me down? Are you going to let me go? She could be talking about a person. She could be talking about depression. And I think that's one thing we haven't really touched on is that she was really talking about, people were not talking about mental health in songs back then. People were not being very open about their, mental health travails back then. That's a very
Yeah.
bold thing to do, because people, because that was really making herself vulnerable. And, with the way mental health was sort of considered at that time, you talk about that, people might say, oh, you're crazy, or, you get a reputation. And, obviously we're a little bit more enlightened now. So we wouldn't, if someone's talking about depression, especially I think younger generations, they're very open about it, which I think is great, which I think you
Yeah.
need, it's so much of a, it's one of the nicer evolutions I think that have come in recent years is that people are not afraid to talk about that, which is so important. So she
Right.
was really talking about these things, that no one else was, and especially in the song in general, and just the idea of blue, because blue is such is such an evocative thing because you have so many shades of blue as well. You have darker blue, you have lighter blue, you have aquamarine. Depending on what
Right.
shade you use, can also kind of convey something different. So I think it's such a simple word and such a simple concept, but there's so many different ways that it goes to in all of these things.
I mean, there's a
Yeah,
whole
and part
genre.
of
Yeah.
oh well, I was gonna say like part of with the talking about top 500 albums, we run into kind of especially I think people put a lot for those lists. They put a lot on lyrics, so we've been running into
Mhm.
really kind of masterful lyric writers, but like every once in a while, like especially with this album, you go, oh well, there's another tier for people here. Like you said, like there's philosophy, there's poetry, and then there's a whole lot of very specific personal stuff or just day-to-day stuff like sprinkled in there. And there's like it's just such a cool balance that not much else kind of gets me. And that was one of the big things, especially as a person we've mentioned on the show before a couple times, but like especially as a person who maybe leans more towards listening to instrumentation and music. Like when something like that jumps out at me, like I tend to notice and be like, oh, okay, hold on, this is something important.
Yeah, that's the showstopper. Yeah, exactly. So Joni's work after Blue, kind of hit on it earlier when I mentioned Hejira, became more experimental, jazz oriented. Do you think that acclaim surrounding Blue kind of obscured how fearless she was and gave her that permission afterwards to become, more artistically open, or was it just kind of an act of defiance? Where does that come from?
I think that this is just her, following her muse and following, like, here's what I'm thinking sort of at the moment. And I think what the most interesting thing to me is that I feel like people have now, especially have their own sort of favorite Joni eras. Like there's people who are like, no, Court and Spark is her best record. We have a lot of that. Or we have people who say, no, Hejira is her best record. There's Ladies of the Canyon. And so I feel like Blue, and obviously is a perfect record. And so it makes sense why it's sort of like her pinnacle high point. But it is interesting that there's people who, I think now see kind of the different eras of where, she was experimenting and they gravitate toward that. So I think that's kind of been one of the coolest things is that, I think people appreciate more of the breadth and depth of her career now more than maybe they ever did. But it's awesome. I mean, and it's super cool to see, how quickly she evolved too. I mean, when you look at she in the first 5 years of the 70s, she released like five amazing records. Like
Right.
what,
She
it's like
didn't stop.
right. And then Hijira came in 76. So I mean, it was like, the 70s were remarkably productive, remarkably full of evolution for her. Kind of like what the Beatles did in the 60s.
Oh,
And
totally.
obviously it's they were even more of a kind of a compressed sort of evolution. But, when people were really on, they were really on. And she was definitely just firing on all creative cylinders and just so inspired by music and the world around her.
You got a flavor for everybody. And one artist that she's kind of reminding me of that sense too that we've talked about on the show is Tom Waits. We did we did his very first album actually, and it's completely different than any of the other stuff. It's not the gravelly voiced, making instruments out of garbage material type stuff that we come to expect. But you start to see the progression over time and this freedom to go in different eras, because everybody loves what they're putting out. And I don't know. I'm looking forward to learning more about Joni, especially post Hygira, post Blue, because that's like what I know. So where would you recommend I go next?
I'm very glad you said that actually, because I mean, the one song that is one of my favorite Joni songs I always tell people to listen to is Amelia. And that's basically it's based on Amelia Earhart, but she sort of braids her own story into it. And so like in recent years, like I've that has been like my song. Like I love that
Hmm.
song so much. And so that, but I say listen to Joni's 80s records, Wild Things Run
Okay.
Fast and Dog Eat Dog. And I think that's kind of a controversial statement because they definitely, production wise, they sound very 80s. Like it's not like, there was definitely a little bit of like, let's see if we can get Joni on MTV, which is so weird, I know. But it's great. I mean, Thomas Dolby, co-produced Dog Eat Dog, the
Oh
song.
wow.
Yeah. And
Okay, I'm going there immediately.
yeah, it's amazing. And they're such interesting sounding records, and they sound very contemporary. And obviously, for someone like Joni, who was always kind of doing her own thing and going against the grain, it's interesting to see her do her version of contemporary music, basically. And I always have a soft spot for veteran artists who, when they went 80s. When like Paul McCartney, temporary secretary, I'm like, Paul, play that every time. When he played that on a recent tour, like I was the one in the crowd, like, cheering very loudly. When everyone else was like, what, this is not what's going
What
on
is
here.
it? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So I always kind of like those little detours, but I did a piece a couple of years ago and really dug into these records, and her 80s era has some really interesting stuff in it.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm going to be listening to that too. I mean, if nothing else, yeah, you got us with Thomas Dolby. That's going to be a fun listening adventure I'm looking for. So after the writing and listening you've done about Jodie over, the 10 years, what do you think is something people misunderstand most about her?
This is such a big question, and this is such a good question because I feel like, you know, now, y- see, I don't necessarily, I feel like if you asked me this question like 15 years ago, I think, it would have basically been, that people would still focus on her relationships, like I said now. And I think maybe what people like misunderstand, um, but I don't know, and that's a good question. I am not sure what people misunderstand most about Joni now. Just because, I think she's at an interesting stage in her career when she's sort of, coming back into the public eye and kind of having her, being able to take kind of a victory lap, but also just kind
Yeah.
of, finding new generations and really, I'm here. This is what Joni Mitchell is going to do in 2026. So I don't know. I mean, it's a really good question. I am not sure.
Yeah, no, I think it's been really cool to see her get her flowers, so to speak, in the last year or two, especially as we've seen like, the very female dominated pop charts, whether
Mhm.
it's, Olivia Rodrigo, Taylor, you name it, like, and they're still making room for the legends where maybe, what before was the male dominated, you know, Hall of Fame tours, with the Stones and Paul McCartney, things like that. There's getting more mainstream love for Joni again, and that's been kind of cool to see and just to learn about along the way.
And I mean,
So
it's so funny because when you look at like, the people who have been like in her Joni jams, you sort of, obviously Brandy Carlisle is always there, but like when you also see like, the pictures people have shared of her, like her parties at her house in California, you never know who's going to show up. Like I think Elton John has been there, of course, obviously, Annie
just in
Lennox.
the neighborhood.
That-
Yeah.
Right, but like it's so funny because there's like a motley crew of people and you hear stories about people who've shown up to them and things like that. You just never know who's going to show up. And I love that. I think that's so cool and just so, indicative of just what a broad sort of impact she has. She just, gathers a bunch of people together. We're just going to hang out and sing and make music. Like that's amazing. That's so great.
That's exactly, and that's how it comes about. It's not always just sitting in the studio, hammering it out, saying I got to make a song. It's just sitting around with people and letting ourselves be ourselves, and that's
Right.
I don't know. I do love that about her. So as we wrap up here, Annie, is there anywhere out in the great wide world of social media that we can find you? Anything you're writing, you're working on, any books you'd like to talk about?
Absolutely. So I'm trying to think. So I am generally I'm online under my name on Facebook and Blue Sky, LinkedIn. My Instagram is Annie Zaleski Author. That's probably where I am the most in terms of like sharing work and things like that. I actually have a book in August coming out called Dolly Parton: The Stories Behind the Songs.
Oh,
So very excited about that. Obviously, Dolly and Joni came up kind of at the same time, have some very, interesting parallels, just in terms of, talking about and, narrating their lives. And speaking of intensity, I think people might be surprised at the kind of songs that Dolly was writing earlier in her career, in very, very good ways. And so, yeah, so that's coming out
okay,
um,
great.
in September, or not September, August. And then, like I said, yes,
I
Stevie Nicks
just
did 50 songs.
Mhm. I just did a control F on the enemy list, and I was really sad to see there's no Dolly.
Which don't get,
But
I mean, that's
But
really
there,
terrible.
but there's Frank Sinatra. I mean,
I
yeah,
mean, there's a lot of interesting. We've talked about a lot, but about what's missing from the list. But it's not like they were ignoring country either, which is. And I mean, we just did an episode on. I mean, we've done an episode previously on Graham Parsons, and we just finished one with
Mhm.
the Byrds' "Sweetheart of the Rodeo." So it's not even like it was a blind spot of theirs. Like they know, but I don't know. With 500, I guess you only
those
get so much room.
those wacky Brits, they don't know. Yeah.
But I mean,
You had to make they had to fit in the Libertines like album that came out a month before the list or something like that.
I swear
Naturally.
Dolly's like mid, like, kind of like with Joni, like from about the 1971 to about 75 or so, she put out some really amazing solo records. Like to me, when, she was such a singles artist, just because country music was such a singles artist, but those records in the early 70s are such great artistic statements that makes me sad because they're worthy of discussion kind of on their own. Jolene,
I'm gonna put a reminder on my phone to call you back in September, and maybe we'll just talk Dolly anyway.
we should.
It's our show.
We should.
We're allowed to
Yeah.
do what we want.
No sponsors. Yeah, exactly. Nobody calling the shots but us. I will give you credit too. My daughter had to do a school report on Taylor Swift at the end of the year, where they dress up like they're in a wax museum. So we were able to pull some notes from one of your books and everything, and
Yay.
it got her reading, which is always good. So a plus. But
I
yeah,
love
no, thanks. Yeah. It was a fun one. She even got the wig and all the sparkly stuff and everything going on. So yeah, fully immersive. A whole
Aw.
a whole cafeteria of Taylor Swift's. It was a wonderful sight.
Oh, that's adorable. I love it.
All right. Well, wrapping up here, Annie, thank you so much. We hope you
Yeah,
can
thank
join us
you.
again sometime. Been incredibly informative about Joni, and now we have our listening assignments for the weekend, I'm sure. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.